The airport was already busy that morning. People rushed through the wide halls pulling suitcases. Others checked their phones while sipping coffee, and a few just stared at the big screen that showed flight numbers and destinations. Among the noise, a man named David walked quietly toward his gate. He wore a clean white shirt, dark jeans, and a navy jacket. Nothing about him stood out much except for the calmness in his eyes. David had been flying planes for more than 20 years, but today he wasn't going to work. He had just finished a long shift the night before, and now he was flying home to spend a few days with his family. He had booked a business class seat, a small reward to himself for all the nights spent away from home. As he arrived at the boarding gate, he greeted the staff politely, handed over his ticket, and waited for the woman behind the counter to scan it. She smiled, told him, "Have a pleasant flight," and he walked toward the plane. It was just another routine morning for him, until it wasn't. Inside the aircraft, a flight attendant was helping passengers find their seats. Her name tag said Susan. She looked busy and serious, but there was a certain sharpness in her tone as she spoke to passengers. When she saw David stepping into the business class section, she frowned slightly. "Excuse me, sir," she said, blocking his way gently. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" David smiled and handed it over. She looked down at the ticket, then back at him. "This seat is in business class," she said slowly, as if he might not understand. "Yes, that's correct," David replied politely. Susan hesitated. "I think there might be some mistake," she said. "This section is reserved for business class passengers." David nodded. "I understand," he said calmly. "That's what my ticket says." He wasn't upset, at least not yet. Things like this had happened to him before in small ways. Little moments when people looked at him and made quick judgments. He had learned to stay calm even when others didn't. But Susan's expression didn't change. She looked at him again, this time more carefully. "Sir, maybe you should check your boarding pass again," she said. "Economy is behind this section." A few passengers nearby looked up from their seats. Some tried not to stare, but curiosity filled their eyes. David could feel it. That uncomfortable silence that forms when someone is being questioned unfairly. He looked down at his boarding pass again and gently pointed to it. "Seat 3A, he said. "That's right here." Susan crossed her arms. "I'm sorry, but business class is for professionals and frequent flyers. Maybe the system made an error. Can you please step aside while I check?" Her words carried something sharper than just doubt. David's smile faded slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Of course," he said, stepping aside politely. Susan walked toward the front to speak to another attendant. David could hear bits of their conversation, quiet but not quiet enough. "He says he's in business," Susan whispered. "Did you check his ticket?" the other attendant asked. "I did, but maybe someone entered it wrong," she said. "He doesn't look like—" Her voice trailed off as she noticed David watching her calmly. David stood quietly, holding his carry-on bag. He didn't say a word. Years of experience in aviation had taught him patience, even when things felt unfair. After a few moments, Susan came back, her face tight with forced politeness. "I checked with the system," she said. "Your seat is valid. You can go ahead." David nodded. "Thank you." He walked to his seat and placed his bag in the overhead compartment. As he sat down, he could feel the eyes of a few passengers on him. Some looked sympathetic, others looked awkward. He didn't blame them. Moments like this made everyone uncomfortable. Susan continued her work, greeting new passengers, but every now and then David could feel her glancing his way. Maybe she was embarrassed, or maybe she still didn't believe he belonged there. He took out a book, pretending to read, but his mind wasn't on the words. He thought about how often small moments like this happened, at restaurants, in hotels, at security checks. People making judgments before knowing anything about him. The truth was, David had given more than half his life to flying. He had logged thousands of flight hours, trained younger pilots, and even been honored for his calm decision-making during a difficult landing years ago. But none of that mattered to someone who only saw his skin color or his casual clothes. After a few minutes, another flight attendant, an older man, came over to check on the passengers. He smiled kindly at David and asked if he needed anything. David thanked him and said he was fine. The kindness in the man's tone reminded David that not everyone carried prejudice, and that helped him let go of the frustration building inside. Still, something about the earlier exchange lingered. He thought about how easy it was for people to make assumptions and how hard it was to change them. When the boarding was almost complete, Susan came by again, doing a final check before takeoff. Her voice softened slightly as she asked, "Would you like a drink before we depart?" David looked up at her and smiled politely. "No, thank you," he said. She nodded and walked away. Maybe she felt guilty, maybe not. David couldn't tell. He didn't want to dwell on it. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the soft hum of the engines calm him. He thought of his family waiting at home, his wife, who always left a light on when he came back from long flights, and his son, who loved hearing stories about the sky. That thought brought a quiet warmth to his chest. As the plane began to move, David looked out the window. The runway stretched ahead, bright under the morning sun. He watched as the ground crew waved and the engines roared louder. Soon the plane lifted off, leaving the city below. For a moment, everything felt peaceful again. The clouds outside looked soft and endless, and he remembered why he had fallen in love with flying in the first place. Up here, above all the noise and misunderstanding, everyone was equal. But that peace didn't last long. Midway through the flight, Susan approached again. There was a small frown on her face as she leaned toward him. "Sir," she said softly, "I just want to confirm again. You're supposed to be in business class, correct?" David looked at her, a little surprised. "Yes," he said. "I believe we already cleared that." "Yes, of course," she said quickly. "It's just that another passenger claims you may have taken their seat by mistake. I'm just checking." He sighed quietly, though he didn't show frustration. "Here's my boarding pass," he said, handing it over again. She looked at it, checked her list, then back at him. Her expression changed slightly, part embarrassment, part defensiveness. "Right," she said. "Thank you for confirming." When she left again, David could feel his patience wearing thin. He had been kind, polite, and calm. Still, she kept questioning him as if he didn't belong. He tried to focus on his book again, but the words blurred together. He thought about how many times people like him had to prove themselves. Not just once, but over and over. It wasn't just tiring. It was painful. A passenger sitting nearby leaned toward him quietly and said, "I saw what happened earlier. You handled that very gracefully." David smiled faintly. "Thank you," he said. "Sometimes it's better to stay calm." The man nodded. "You have more patience than I would." David chuckled softly, though there wasn't much humor in it. "You learn it over time," he said. The rest of the flight was mostly quiet. But David's thoughts kept circling back to that moment at the gate. That instant when someone had looked at him and decided he didn't belong. He wondered if Susan had even realized how hurtful her words were. How heavy they could feel to someone who'd spent his life proving his worth. By the time the plane began its descent, David had decided one thing. He wouldn't let anger define his day. He couldn't control other people's actions, but he could control his own. That was something his father had always taught him. "You can't stop the wind, son. You can only steady your wings." He smiled at the memory. Outside the window, the clouds parted and the city appeared below. Small, colorful, alive. As the wheels touched down and the engines slowed, he took a deep breath. The flight was over, but something told him this story wasn't. There was a strange feeling in the air, as if fate had another lesson waiting, one that would soon surprise everyone on board. The plane had been flying for nearly an hour when the first signs of tension began to fade. The hum of the engines created a soft background sound, and most passengers had settled into their seats. Some were reading, others watching movies, and a few were already asleep with blankets pulled up to their chins. David sat quietly, staring out the window. The view outside was beautiful, a sea of white clouds stretching far beyond sight. Up here, the world felt peaceful. He always believed the sky had a way of humbling people, reminding them that all their troubles and judgments looked small from this high above. Still, he couldn't fully relax. His mind kept replaying the awkward moment from earlier, the one with Susan, the way she had looked at him, the tone in her voice. It still echoed faintly in his thoughts. He wasn't angry, not exactly. It was more a quiet disappointment, the kind that sinks into your chest and stays there for a while. He closed his eyes and tried to let it go. But peace didn't last long. Susan passed by again, checking seatbelts and drink orders. She paused briefly near David's seat, her expression polite but distant. She asked if he needed anything, and he simply shook his head. She nodded and walked away quickly as if afraid to linger too long. David sighed softly. He knew what was happening, the uneasy balance between guilt and pride that some people carried when they realized they had been wrong. He didn't want an apology. What he wanted was understanding, a quiet change in perspective that came from reflection, not from words spoken just to ease guilt. A few rows ahead, a couple was whispering about their travel plans. A little girl giggled while showing her mother drawings in a notebook. It was an ordinary flight, but David couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unsettled in the air. He decided to distract himself by scrolling through the in-flight entertainment. He chose a light movie, something funny, but he barely watched. His thoughts wandered again, back to the years he'd spent flying, the people he'd met, and the quiet moments between sky and ground where he felt most alive. After a while, he heard Susan's voice again, this time from a few seats behind him. She was speaking to another passenger, a man who sounded irritated. "Sir, I understand your concern," she said in her careful, polite tone, "but we're doing everything we can to make you comfortable." The man's voice was sharper. "Comfortable? I paid for this seat and it doesn't even recline properly. I've been pressing the button for 10 minutes. Susan apologized again and the passenger sighed heavily. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. David couldn't help but smile faintly. He had seen it all before. People losing patience over small inconveniences while flying through the sky in a machine that defied gravity. Perspective, he thought, was often the rarest thing on Earth. But then something unexpected happened. A few minutes later, Susan returned to David's section. This time her face was slightly pale. She looked uneasy. She leaned over to speak to the passenger across the aisle, but her eyes flicked briefly toward David. He noticed her fidgeting with her hands, trying to appear calm. Then the plane suddenly jolted, not violently but enough to make a few passengers gasp. The seatbelt light turned on, and a soft chime sounded overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's voice through the speakers, steady but serious. "We're experiencing a bit of turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The cabin grew quiet except for the sound of the engines and the soft rustle of belts clicking into place. The plane shook lightly again. David stayed calm. Turbulence was nothing new to him. He could almost predict the rhythm of the air, the dips and rises, the sound of the wind against the fuselage. Susan, however, looked nervous. She moved down the aisle quickly, making sure everyone was secure. Her eyes darted around, and when she reached David's row, she gripped a seat for balance. "Sir, please fasten your seatbelt tightly," she said, her voice trembling slightly. David gave her a calm nod. "It's fastened," he said. She hesitated, then moved on. The plane shook again, a bit stronger this time. A few passengers gasped, and someone whispered a prayer. David stayed still, watching the cabin crew closely. He could tell from the way they moved and the tone of the captain's voice that the turbulence wasn't severe, just uncomfortable. After several minutes, the shaking eased and the tension in the air began to lift. People started whispering again, laughing nervously about the scare. Susan, visibly relieved, exhaled and straightened her uniform. She made eye contact with David briefly and gave a small, uncertain smile. He returned it gently. Then a familiar voice broke through the cabin speakers again, this time more casual. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've cleared the rough patch and everything is looking smooth ahead. We'll be at cruising altitude again shortly. Thank you for your patience." His tone carried calm authority, the kind that came only from experience. When the announcement ended, something interesting happened. The co-pilot stepped out of the cockpit for a brief moment to check with the crew. He was young, probably in his early 30s, and his face lit up with surprise when he spotted David sitting in the business class row. "Captain Miller?" the co-pilot said, his voice full of disbelief and excitement. David looked up and smiled warmly. "Hey there," he said. "Didn't expect to see you here." The co-pilot grinned. "I can't believe this. You trained me during my early days at the academy. You were one of the best instructors we had." The nearby passengers turned their heads, curious. Susan froze mid-step, her eyes widening slightly. She had just realized who he was. The young co-pilot laughed softly. "It's an honor to have you on board, sir. I learned so much from you back then, especially how to stay calm under pressure." David chuckled. Glad to see you're still keeping the skies safe. The co-pilot nodded. Always trying to live up to the example you set, Captain. He gave a quick nod of respect and returned to the cockpit. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but its effect was powerful. The cabin had gone completely quiet during those few moments. Every passenger nearby had heard the conversation clearly. Susan stood frozen, her face pale and her lips pressed tightly together. The realization hit her hard. The man she had questioned, the one she had doubted and embarrassed earlier, was not only a pilot, he was a respected one. Someone who had trained others to do the very job she admired. David didn't gloat or look smug. He simply smiled faintly and returned his gaze to the window. There was no need for words. The truth had spoken for itself. For the next few minutes, Susan barely spoke. Her usual confident tone was gone. She moved more carefully, her eyes lowered slightly each time she passed by. There was a quiet humility in her movements now, something unspoken but deeply felt. David noticed, but he said nothing. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in making others feel small, even when they deserved a moment of reflection. He had learned long ago that real change doesn't come from shaming people. It comes from showing them another way to see the world. He thought about the young co-pilot's words. "You taught me how to stay calm under pressure." That made him smile. Maybe that lesson had found another use today. The rest of the flight continued smoothly. The turbulence was gone and passengers relaxed once more. Laughter and conversation filled the cabin again. But for Susan, something had clearly shifted. Every time she looked toward David, her face softened a little more, as if she was quietly trying to process everything that had just happened. Later, when she offered drinks again, she approached David carefully. "Would you like something now, sir?" she asked in a quiet voice. David looked up, met her eyes, and smiled kindly. "Water would be fine, thank you." She nodded, brought him a bottle, and placed it gently on his tray. There was something in her expression, regret maybe, or shame, but also a small spark of respect that hadn't been there before. David took the water and thanked her. She nodded again and moved on. As he sat there, sipping slowly, he thought about how strange life could be, how quickly one's assumptions could turn into lessons. He hadn't planned to teach anyone today. He just wanted to get home. But sometimes life had other plans. Outside the window, the clouds drifted past in golden light. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft orange and pink. It was beautiful, peaceful in a way that words could barely capture. David smiled to himself. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this. Every moment, even the uncomfortable ones, could carry a message. And sometimes the best way to deliver that message was through patience, grace, and quiet strength. He leaned back in his seat, feeling the hum of the engines beneath him, and closed his eyes. The world below was still full of noise and misunderstanding, but up here, for now, the sky felt like the fairest place of all. The flight continued peacefully for the next hour. The light outside had changed to a warm golden color that filled the cabin with a soft glow. The clouds below looked like waves frozen in time, stretching all the way to the horizon. Many passengers had closed their eyes, resting after a long day. Some were still watching movies while others quietly sipped coffee or tea. David sat still, enjoying the calm moment. The air inside the plane felt lighter now. The earlier tension had faded and there was an easy stillness in the cabin. He could feel it, that small shift in energy when people start to relax again. He looked around and noticed Susan moving through the aisle more quietly than before. Her movements were slower, more thoughtful. She didn't avoid him anymore, but every time their eyes met, she gave a small nod, almost like an unspoken apology. David appreciated that. He didn't need words. Sometimes silence carried more meaning than any explanation could. He leaned his head against the seat and closed his eyes, listening to the steady hum of the engines. The rhythm was comforting, almost like a song he had heard 1,000 times. Then suddenly he heard a faint sound, something that didn't belong to the usual noise of the plane. It was a soft gasp followed by a thud. His eyes opened instantly. A few rows behind him, a woman had collapsed onto the aisle. A cry of panic filled the air. "Help! Somebody help!" a passenger shouted. In seconds, the calm flight turned into chaos. People unbuckled their seatbelts, trying to see what happened. The woman lay motionless, her face pale and her breathing faint. Susan rushed forward, her voice shaking as she called for help. "Everyone, please remain seated," she said. "Is there a doctor on board?" A few passengers looked around, but no one responded. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with fear. David stood up quickly. His instincts kicked in, not just as a pilot, but as someone trained to handle emergencies calmly. He had been through fire drills, evacuations, and even near disasters. He knew that panic only made things worse. He stepped into the aisle and knelt beside the woman. "Let me help," he said in a calm, steady voice. Susan looked startled to see him move so quickly. "Sir, please sit down," she said out of reflex. "We need to—" But when she saw the steady confidence in his face, she stopped mid-sentence. "Check her pulse," David said firmly, already assessing the situation. "We need to keep her airway clear." Another flight attendant brought a small medical kit. David gently tilted the woman's head back and checked her breathing. "She's breathing, but it's weak," he said. "We need oxygen right away." Susan nodded and hurried to grab a small oxygen cylinder from the emergency cabinet. Her hands trembled slightly as she attached the mask, but David guided her calmly. "Take a deep breath," he said softly. "You're doing fine." Passengers watched silently, their eyes wide with worry. The plane suddenly felt smaller. Every sound louder than usual. The hum of the engines, the rustle of movement. The quiet gasps from nearby seats. David placed the oxygen mask gently over the woman's face and spoke to her in a calm voice. "Ma'am, you're going to be all right. Just try to breathe slowly." After a few moments, the woman's chest began to rise and fall more evenly. The color started to return to her cheeks. Susan let out a shaky breath of relief. David looked up at her. "She'll be okay," he said. "She just needs to stay still and breathe." Susan nodded, visibly emotional. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't know what to do at first." "You did fine," David said. "You called for help. That's the most important thing." The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Cabin crew, report status, please." Susan pressed the intercom button. "Captain, we had a passenger collapse. She's stable now, receiving oxygen." There was a brief pause, then the captain replied, "Copy that. Please keep me updated. And thank whoever helped." When she turned back to David, her eyes softened completely. "You really know what you're doing," she said quietly. David gave a small, modest smile. "I've seen a few things in my time," he said. The other passengers began to relax again, whispering softly among themselves. Some of them smiled at David, others gave small nods of gratitude. The fear that had filled the cabin moments ago was slowly replaced with calm admiration. After ensuring the woman was comfortable and stable, David finally returned to his seat. The adrenaline in his body started to fade, leaving behind a wave of quiet exhaustion, but it was worth it. The woman was safe and the panic had passed. A few minutes later, the co-pilot's voice came over the speaker again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your first officer speaking. We had a minor medical situation, but thanks to the help of one of our passengers, Captain Miller, everything is now under control." There was a brief pause, and then the cabin filled with gentle applause. Some people clapped slowly, others smiled warmly in David's direction. Susan looked at him with genuine respect now, a completely different expression from the one she had worn that morning. Her voice was soft when she spoke. "I didn't know you were a captain," she said. "I had no idea." David looked at her kindly. "You weren't supposed to," he said. "Today I was just a passenger." She swallowed hard, guilt and admiration mixing in her expression. "You helped us more than anyone else could have," she said. I'm really sorry for how I treated you earlier." David looked at her for a moment, then smiled gently. "It's all right," he said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." Her eyes glistened slightly, but she nodded, grateful for his grace. "Thank you," she whispered. The plane continued its smooth journey through the evening sky. The clouds below now glowed softly under the fading sunlight. Everything felt quieter, not just because people were tired, but because something had shifted inside that cabin. A moment of humanity had reminded everyone how fragile and connected they all were. David sat back, taking a deep breath. His mind went back to the woman who had fainted. She was awake now, resting, and he was glad for that. He wasn't one to seek attention, but moments like these always reminded him why he loved his job. Not just the flying, but the responsibility that came with it. As he watched the clouds drift by, he noticed Susan walk past again. This time she stopped beside his seat. "We'll be landing in about an hour," she said softly. "Would you like something to eat or drink?" "It's on us," he smiled. "Just water, thank you." She handed him a new bottle and hesitated before speaking again. "You know," she said slowly, "when I first saw you bored, I thought you didn't belong here. I judged you without even realizing it. But watching how calm you were just now, I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that." David looked at her, his expression gentle but firm. "Sometimes life gives us chances to see people differently," he said. "What we do with those chances is what defines us." She nodded silently. "You're right," she said. "And I'll remember that." David gave her a kind smile. "That's all I could ask for." She walked away quietly, her steps slower and her shoulders lighter. Something in her had changed. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was understanding. Outside, the last light of day faded and the cabin dimmed as the crew prepared for landing. David rested his head back and closed his eyes again. He could still feel the rhythm of the engines, steady and strong beneath his feet. In that quiet moment, he thought about everything that had happened that day. The misunderstanding, the turbulence, the emergency. It all felt like a chain of events leading to one important truth. People often rush to judge, but sometimes life has a way of revealing who we truly are when it matters most. As the plane descended slowly through the evening clouds, the passengers remained calm. The woman who had fainted was sitting up now, smiling weakly at Susan, who stayed near her side. David watched them for a moment, then turned back to the window. The city lights below began to sparkle like tiny stars. He smiled softly. He didn't need recognition or applause. All he wanted was for people like Susan to remember that kindness, patience, and respect could change everything, sometimes even more than words or apologies. The plane touched down smoothly, and a quiet round of applause filled the cabin again. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and full of warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome home." And once again, a special thanks to Captain Miller for his assistance earlier. It's an honor to have him among us. David looked down almost shyly, as a few nearby passengers turned to shake his hand or thank him. He smiled at them all, humble as always. For him, the best reward was simple, seeing everyone safe, knowing the flight had ended not just with the landing, but with a lesson quietly written into the hearts of those who were there. And though he didn't say it out loud, he knew this flight would stay with him for a long time, not because of the turbulence or the emergency, but because of the silent change that had taken place, a change in the air in one person's heart and maybe in a few others too. The soft bump of the wheels touching the runway brought everyone back to the present. The lights outside were dim, the sky painted in shades of deep blue and silver as night settled over the city. Passengers let out quiet sighs of relief, happy to have landed safely. Some clapped softly while others smiled at each other, thankful the long journey was over. David looked out the window, watching the airport lights drift past as the plane slowed down. He always loved that moment after landing, the quiet hum, the sense of completion, the gentle relief that filled the cabin. It reminded him of every flight he'd ever taken, both as a pilot and a passenger. The captain's voice came through the speaker again, calm and warm. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. The time is 8:45 in the evening. Please remain seated until we've reached the gate. And once again, a heartfelt thank you to Captain Miller for his assistance earlier. It's an honor having him aboard." The announcement brought another round of applause from the passengers. David smiled politely but felt a little embarrassed. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. He preferred to stay behind the scenes, letting his actions speak for him. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Susan came down the aisle one last time. Her usual professional smile was softer now, almost genuine. When she reached David's seat, she paused. "Thank you again," she said quietly. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone stay so calm in a situation like that." David smiled gently. "It just comes with experience," he said. "You did well, too. You handled it with care." She shook her head slightly. "You're being kind," she said. "But I know I was wrong earlier. I judged you without knowing who you were. I keep thinking about that moment and it makes me feel awful." David looked at her with steady, understanding eyes. "What matters is that you realize it," he said. We all make mistakes. What we do after is what counts. Her eyes softened. You've taught me more on this flight than I've learned in years of training, she said. David chuckled lightly. Well, life has a way of giving lessons when we least expect them. She smiled back, then moved on to finish her duties as the plane reached the gate. When the seatbelt light turned off, passengers began to stand, reaching for their bags and stretching their legs. The woman who had fainted earlier walked carefully toward the exit with the help of another attendant. She stopped briefly by David's seat, her voice still weak but grateful. Thank you, she said softly. You helped me more than you know, David smiled kindly. I'm glad you're feeling better, he said. Take it easy for a while. She nodded and continued toward the door. As the line of passengers began to move, David waited patiently for the crowd to thin. He didn't mind being one of the last to leave. He preferred quiet exits, always had. When he finally stood and reached for his bag, he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was the young co-pilot. Captain, the younger man said warmly, the crew and I would love for you to meet the rest of the team before you leave. The captain would like to thank you personally. David smiled, a little surprised. That's kind of him, he said. Of course. He followed the co-pilot toward the front of the cabin. The door to the cockpit was open, and the captain, a tall man with graying hair, stepped out with a big smile. Captain Miller, he said, shaking David's hand firmly. It's an honor. I heard about what you did today. You saved us from what could have been a very difficult situation. David shook his head modestly. Just doing what anyone else would have done, he said. The captain laughed lightly. Maybe. But not everyone would have done it with such calm and grace. He turned to Susan and the rest of the crew standing nearby. You all just flew with one of the best pilots in the industry, he said. I've read reports about his emergency landings. Smooth as silk every time. Susan's eyes widened slightly. She looked both proud and humbled to have shared the same flight. I didn't know that, she said softly. David chuckled. That was a long time ago, he said. These days, I'm just happy to make it home on time. The crew laughed warmly, the atmosphere light and friendly now. For the first time, everyone looked at David with genuine respect. Not because of his title, but because of the person he had shown himself to be. After a few more kind words, David thanked them and stepped out of the plane. The airport corridor was quiet except for the soft hum of cleaning machines and the distant sound of rolling suitcases. He walked slowly, feeling both tired and content. As he entered the terminal, he saw passengers from his flight ahead, some glancing back at him, whispering to each other, smiling appreciatively. A few even waved. He waved back with a humble smile. When he reached the baggage area, he took a deep breath. It felt good to be on solid ground again. He spotted his suitcase quickly and started toward the exit. Then he heard a familiar voice calling out, "Captain, wait!" He turned around and saw Susan hurrying toward him. Her hair was a little messy and her face showed a mix of nervousness and determination. "I'm sorry to stop you again," she said, catching her breath, "but I couldn't leave without saying this properly." David tilted his head slightly, waiting. "I want to thank you again," she said. "Not just for what you did during the flight, but for how you handled everything before that. You could have made a scene when I treated you unfairly. You had every right to. But instead you showed kindness and patience. That means more than you know." David looked at her for a moment, then smiled gently. "I've learned over time that anger only makes things worse," he said. "If I can show someone something better through patience, I try to do that." She nodded slowly. "You did," she said softly. "You really did. You changed how I see things. I'll never forget this flight." David gave a small nod. "That's good to hear," he said. "Just remember, everyone's fighting a battle you can't always see. A little kindness goes a long way." Her eyes glistened again, but this time it was from genuine gratitude, not shame. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Safe travels, Captain." "You too," David replied warmly. "And keep doing what you do. You make a difference every day, even when you don't realize it." She smiled, gave a small wave, and turned back toward the gate. David stood there for a moment, watching her walk away, and then continued toward the exit. The cool night air hit him as the automatic doors opened. It felt fresh and freeing after hours inside the cabin. Outside, he spotted a few taxis waiting by the curb. The city lights shimmered across wet pavement and the air smelled faintly of rain. He placed his suitcase down, took out his phone, and called his wife to let her know he had landed safely. Her voice on the other end was warm and filled with relief. "You're home," she said happily. "Almost," he said with a smile. "I'll be there soon." They talked briefly, sharing the familiar comfort of two people who had spent years apart because of work, yet always found their way back to each other. When the call ended, David looked up at the sky. The same sky he had just flown through now stretched endlessly above him. He thought about everything that had happened, the misunderstanding, the turbulence, the emergency, the apology. It struck him how unpredictable life could be. A few hours ago, he was just another passenger, judged unfairly before even saying a word. Now he had somehow become a quiet reminder to others that respect, grace, and patience could turn any situation around. He picked up his bag and walked toward a waiting cab. The driver greeted him politely and asked where he was headed. David gave his address and leaned back in the seat as the car pulled away. The city rolled by outside, lights flickering past like stars on the ground. In that quiet moment, he felt something he hadn't in a long while: peace. Not just because he was home, but because he knew that the small act of staying calm had created a ripple far bigger than he could see. He smiled to himself, remembering something his father used to say: "People remember how you make them feel, not what you tell them." And that night on that flight, he had made people feel something, not fear, not anger, but hope. As the car turned into his neighborhood, David looked up at the sky one last time. The stars were faint behind the city lights, but he could still see them. He whispered softly to himself, "Another safe landing." And for him, that meant more than just the end of a flight. It meant a quiet victory for kindness, patience, and understanding in a world that often forgot their value. The next morning, sunlight streamed softly through the curtains of David's living room. The air was quiet, broken only by the sound of a kettle whistling in the kitchen. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee in his hands, taking small sips as he looked through the window. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. A child rode a bicycle down the street. Someone was walking their dog. The world felt calm again, just as he liked it. He still felt a quiet sense of disbelief about what had happened on that flight. It wasn't the emergency or even the turbulence that stayed with him. It was how a simple misunderstanding had turned into a moment that touched so many hearts. He hadn't set out to make a statement. All he had done was stay calm and be himself, but somehow that had been enough to change something in people. His phone buzzed softly on the table. It was a message from one of his colleagues. "You're trending online," it read. David blinked in surprise. He opened the message and saw a link. It led to a video someone had taken inside the plane. The video showed the captain's announcement, passengers clapping, and a few seconds of David standing quietly, smiling as people applauded. The caption said, "The man in seat 24A, a true example of grace and professionalism." The comments below were filled with kind words. People wrote things like, "This man deserves all the respect in the world, and he didn't raise his voice. Didn't get angry. He just showed what dignity looks like." Others shared similar experiences, talking about times they had been judged unfairly and how they wished they had handled it with the same calm. David leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slowly. He didn't like attention. He had spent most of his career avoiding it. But reading those words made him realize something. Sometimes you don't choose to make an impact. Life chooses for you. He thought about Susan, the flight attendant. He hoped she was doing all right. She had made a mistake, yes, but she had also faced it. That took courage, too. He respected that. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the airline's headquarters. It was a short note from the director of flight operations. "Captain Miller, we are incredibly proud of how you represented our airline. Your professionalism and humility reflect the values we stand for. We'd love for you to share your story with our new recruits next month." David smiled quietly. He hadn't expected that, but the idea of speaking to young pilots, of teaching them not just how to fly but how to carry themselves with kindness, felt right. Maybe that was what this whole experience was about. Later that day, David decided to take a walk. The autumn air was crisp and the trees along the street were painted in gold and red. As he walked through the park near his house, a man approached him with a hesitant smile. "Excuse me," the man said. "Are you Captain Miller?" David nodded politely. "Yes, I am. I saw the video," the man said, his tone sincere. I just wanted to say thank you. My daughter's training to be a pilot. I showed her your story. She said it made her feel proud to follow that path. You reminded her that character matters as much as skill. David smiled, touched. That means a lot, he said. Tell her to keep working hard. The skies need more good people. The man nodded gratefully and walked away, leaving David with a warm feeling in his chest. It was humbling to know that something so simple, a calm response, a quiet choice, could inspire someone else. That evening he received another message, this time from Susan. It was a short but heartfelt note. Captain, I just wanted you to know that I spoke to my supervisor today. I told them everything that happened, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I realized I needed to own my mistake. They've arranged for me to take part in a new training program about awareness and bias. I asked to be part of it because I want to do better. I also wanted to say thank you again. You showed me what true leadership looks like. David read the message twice. He felt a quiet sense of relief. People could change. Sometimes they just needed a moment that opened their eyes. He typed back, I appreciate your message. Growth comes from honesty. You're already doing the right thing. I wish you all the best. After sending the reply, he closed his phone and sat back in his chair. The room was softly lit, and he could hear the sound of the clock ticking gently on the wall. For the first time in a long while, he felt completely at peace with everything. The following week, David returned to work. As he walked into the airport, several staff members recognized him and smiled. A few stopped to shake his hand, thanking him for the example he had set. He accepted their words humbly, always responding with a gentle nod or a small smile. At the training center, he stood before a room full of new pilots, young men and women filled with energy, dreams, and nervous excitement. He began speaking not from a script but from the heart. I know you've spent years studying flight manuals and memorizing checklists, he said, but there's something even more important you need to learn. It's how to carry yourself when things don't go as planned, when people test your patience, when situations feel unfair. How you respond will define you more than any flight you'll ever complete. The room was quiet. Every eye was on him. He continued softly. You can't control how others see you, but you can control how you act. And when you choose kindness over anger, grace over pride, you not only make the skies safer, you make the world a little better. When he finished, the room filled with applause. But it wasn't the loud kind that made him uncomfortable. It was warm, genuine, appreciative. He saw hope in their faces, and that meant everything to him. Later, one of the trainees approached him privately. Sir, the young woman said, my brother showed me that video before I even knew you were speaking here. It meant a lot to me. I just wanted to say, you reminded me why I wanted to do this job. David smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Then keep that reason close, he said. It'll guide you through the hardest days. Weeks passed, but the story didn't fade. It continued to circulate online, shared by news outlets, reposted by travel pages, and discussed on talk shows. People called it the flight that changed hearts. But for David, it was never about fame. It was about a simple truth, one that he hoped people would carry with them. He returned to his regular schedule, flying routes across the country. Every now and then, a passenger would recognize him and thank him quietly. Sometimes a young flight attendant would smile nervously and say, You're the reason I joined this airline. He never grew tired of hearing it. Not because it made him proud, but because it reminded him that goodness spreads quietly, one heart at a time. One evening, months later, David was preparing for a night flight. As he stood by the cockpit door greeting passengers, he noticed a familiar face in uniform walking down the aisle. Susan. She had been assigned as part of his crew. Their eyes met and she smiled, this time with genuine warmth. Captain, she said respectfully, it's good to see you again. Good to see you too, David replied, smiling. As they worked together that night, everything felt natural, easy. The crew moved in harmony. The passengers were calm, and the sky outside was clear and full of stars. During a quiet moment before landing, Susan turned to him and said softly, I used to think respect came from authority, but I learned it really comes from how you treat people. Thank you for showing me that. David gave a small nod. We're all still learning, he said. That's the beauty of it. When the flight ended and passengers began to disembark, David took a moment to look out the cockpit window. The city below glittered with light, each one representing a story, a person, a moment that mattered. He thought about how connected everyone really was, how one simple act could ripple through countless lives. As he stepped off the plane, he smiled quietly to himself. Not every lesson needed to be loud or dramatic. Some of the most powerful ones happened in silence, carried in the hearts of those who witnessed them. That night, as he walked through the terminal toward the exit, he passed by a group of travelers watching a video on their phone. He caught a glimpse. It was his story again. They were smiling, nodding, saying how much it inspired them. He didn't stop to say anything. He didn't need to. He simply kept walking, blending into the crowd, carrying the quiet satisfaction that maybe, just maybe, he had made the world a little kinder. One flight, one moment, one choice at a time.